I asked about the date of my son's wedding with a soft curiosity, expecting him to smile, blush maybe, and give me a date I could circle on my calendar, a date I would prepare for with love and pride. Instead, his wife's voice came through the phone, cold and clipped. "We got married yesterday, just for special people." My heart cracked in silence. I felt my chest tighten as though the air itself had betrayed me, a mother's place erased with a single sentence. For years I carried him, through nights of fever, through mornings of skipped meals so he could eat, through endless hours of work to cover his tuition. I remember the loans I signed without hesitation, the bills I paid when his part-time jobs didn't cover rent, the sacrifices I hid behind a steady smile. And yet, when the moment came for vows and rings, I was cast aside, not even worthy of an invitation. I stood in the kitchen, phone still in my hand, staring at nothing. Memories rushed like a flood. The day I walked in the rain so he could have bus money. The nights I stitched his torn clothes instead of buying something new for myself. The pride I felt each time he took one step closer to the man I dreamed he'd be. I thought love was enough, that sacrifice had weight, that blood meant belonging. But in that instant, all of it felt like dust blown from his hands. Tears burned but didn't fall. I pressed my palm against the counter, steadying myself, my breath shallow. Humiliation isn't just public. It lives in silence, too, when no one else sees your heart shatter. I whispered to the empty room. If I'm not invited as a mother, then who am I to them? And in the stillness, I felt a storm beginning to rise within me, one that would not be quiet again. When the phone call ended, the silence in my house was unbearable. The walls that once held laughter seemed to press in on me, demanding answers I couldn't give. I couldn't keep this storm inside alone. So the next morning, I called my brother. My voice trembled as I told him what my daughter-in-law had said, the cruel simplicity of her words. "We got married yesterday, just for special people." He went quiet for a long time. Then he said, almost in disbelief, "You? Not invited? After everything you've done for that boy?" His wife gasped in the background, muttering prayers under her breath. They came over that afternoon, and when I repeated the story, my sister-in-law shook her head so hard her earrings rattled. "This is shameful," she said. "How can a son erase his own mother from his wedding day? What kind of woman would let him?" Word spread faster than I expected. Neighbors stopped by with concerned faces, their voices lowered but their eyes sharp with curiosity. Some came with sympathy, others with pity, and a few with that poisonous blend of gossip and judgment. "We thought you must have been ill or away," one neighbor said. Another added softly, "People are talking, you know. They say she didn't want you there." Each word stung deeper than the last. I felt stripped of dignity, as though the years I spent raising him were being rewritten by whispers. Every ring of the phone made me hope it was my son, finally calling to explain. But each time it wasn't him. When I tried his number, it rang unanswered. My messages sat unread, my voice notes ignored. Days passed, then a week, still no word from him. The daughter-in-law's silence was louder than any insult. She had no intention of speaking to me unless it was about money. In the market, women I'd known for years looked at me with a mix of sympathy and scandal. Her own son didn't invite her, I overheard one say as I passed. I pretended not to hear, but inside, my heart tightened like a fist. At night, lying awake in the dark, I replayed everything. I had thought being a good mother, sacrificing, giving, standing by him, would protect me from this kind of betrayal. But now my name was being dragged through conversations at dinner tables. My place as a mother questioned by people who had no right. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to storm into their new home and confront them, but I didn't. Something inside me shifted. Begging wouldn't restore my dignity. Chasing them wouldn't heal this wound. I decided instead to stay quiet, to listen, to watch. Because sometimes silence is sharper than any weapon. And in that silence, I made a vow. I would gather every piece of truth, every hidden detail of their choices, and when the time came, they would realize what it meant to erase a mother. A week passed in tense silence before the phone finally rang. I recognized her number immediately and my stomach twisted, but I answered anyway. Her voice was sharp, impatient, stripped of even the pretense of courtesy. "The rent is overdue," Did you transfer it? Not a greeting, not a trace of shame. Just an order barked like I was nothing more than a bank machine. For a moment, I couldn't even breathe. My mind leapt back through years of receipts, transfers, and withdrawals. The first tuition payment that nearly broke me, the down payment on his old apartment, the endless emergency calls at midnight when he needed help with car repairs or books. I had paid off debts he never even told his friends about, because I couldn't stand to see him struggle. I had said yes so many times that the word no felt foreign on my tongue. But now, after they had sliced me out of their vows and photographs, they had the audacity to ask again. The humiliation turned into fire in my chest. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Didn't I tell you? There was silence on the line, and then she hung up. For once I hadn't begged, hadn't explained, hadn't folded. I sat down at my old wooden table with a notebook and pen. Page after page, I began to write. The loans I had taken, the receipts I had kept, the sacrifices I remembered even when no paper existed. The nights I skipped meals so he could afford textbooks, the time I pawned my jewelry for his car deposit, the quiet battles I had fought to keep his dreams alive. Line after line, I wrote until my hand ached. It was then, staring at the pile of evidence, that the truth landed like a weight I could no longer ignore. They did not see me as a mother, a woman who had given everything out of love. To them, I was only an account to drain, an ATM disguised in flesh and bone. And for the first time, I felt the cold, steady power of knowing I could shut that machine off. The questions refused to leave me alone. Nights turned into restless hours of pacing, of staring at the ceiling, of replaying her words over and over. We got married yesterday, just for special people. Who were these special people, if not the woman who had carried him into this world? My heart wouldn't settle until I knew the truth. I began to ask around quietly, careful not to let desperation leak into my voice. A neighbor's daughter, who had gone to school with the bride, let something slip. There had been a ceremony, small but polished, at a private hall across town. Invitations went only to the bride's relatives, a circle of people I had never once met. My son's own family, me, his uncles, his cousins, were erased like we were stains on a tablecloth they wanted spotless. The confirmation burned. But it wasn't until I opened my phone one evening, scrolling aimlessly through social media, that the knife truly twisted. There they were, photos of the bride in her gown, her parents flanking her proudly, my son at her side looking stiff in his suit. The captions made my stomach clench. Grateful for my real family. Another read, a perfect day, shared only with those who truly matter. My absence wasn't just an oversight. It was a performance. The comments beneath were worse. Heart emojis, congratulations, praises for the intimate choice. Each like felt like a nail hammered deeper into my chest. They had not only excluded me, they had staged my erasure as a virtue, as though my presence would have ruined the purity of their love. I sat with the phone in my hand, numb at first, then shaking. Pain thickened into something sharper, something that no longer wept but simmered. If they wanted to cast me out of the picture, fine, but I knew the years of sacrifice, the unspoken debts, the truths that no curated caption could bury. I whispered into the quiet of my room, the words trembling but steadying as they left my mouth. If they erased me, I will rewrite the story. It started quietly, almost like the hum of a storm you hear long before the clouds break open. First a missed call, then another, then a string of messages from a number I knew by heart but hadn't heard in weeks. My son. The one who couldn't answer when I begged for an explanation. The one who had let his wife speak for him, as if my motherhood was a contract voided. Now his words were short, urgent. Mom, can we talk? I need your help. I didn't answer right away. I let the phone vibrate against the table while I sat still, my hands clasped together to keep them from trembling. I knew exactly what he wanted. Money. The same money that had always been waiting for him. Whether in my purse, in a loan I scraped together, or in the account I still controlled. An account tied to a property I had kept in both our names years ago, when he first asked me to help him build his future. When I finally picked up, his voice was cracked with strain. He danced around the words at first, but soon it came spilling out. The rent was behind, bills had piled up, promises to his wife were crumbling. He needed me. Just this once, he said, like the dozens of just this once before. I listened quietly, my breath steady until he was done, and then I spoke with a calm I didn't know I had. Didn't I tell you? I am not here to rescue you anymore. Silence stretched on the line, heavy and suffocating. I could almost feel his disbelief travel through the phone, as though he couldn't recognize the mother who had always said yes. That night, I opened a folder I had hidden in the back of my closet. Documents. Deeds, the old will I had drafted when I believed my son's loyalty was unquestionable. I called a lawyer the next morning. We went through each page, each clause. For the first time, I didn't speak as a mother blinded by love, but as a woman who had to protect her dignity. Assets were secured, names rewritten, boundaries carved in legal stone. And yet, when I left the lawyer's office, a heaviness lingered in my chest. Love doesn't vanish just because respect has been shattered. I still remembered the boy with scraped knees who once clung to me after nightmares, the young man who called me after his first job interview, his voice trembling with hope. That son still lived in my memory, even if the man he had become no longer honored me. Walking home, I realized something cruel but necessary. Betrayal sometimes demands tough love. Saying no, locking doors, protecting what little is left of your heart, these are not acts of hatred. They are acts of survival, and survival, I whispered to myself, was all I had left to give. I hadn't planned on going, but my brother insisted. If you don't show your face, they'll think you're hiding. You've done nothing wrong. So I dressed in my plainest clothes, the ones that carried no pride and no shame, and went to the family gathering. The hall was filled with the usual chatter, the smells of food, the tinkling of cups. But beneath it all, I could feel the undercurrent. Every glance that lingered on me held the question no one dared to ask out loud. It didn't take long before whispers turned into words. I caught fragments as I passed groups of cousins and neighbors. She wasn't even invited. Imagine your own son doing that. Maybe she refused to go. Each rumor cut at me in a different way, some painting me as the victim, others suggesting I had chosen absence out of pride. My silence kept me safe, but it also made me their canvas. They painted me however they pleased. Then I heard her name. My daughter-in-law, the young woman who had smiled sweetly before marriage but now wore arrogance like a crown. Some cousin of hers had spoken too freely, and soon the story spread like fire through dry grass. She had insisted on the exclusion. She told her family that my presence would be uncomfortable, that she wanted a clean slate, that marrying into my son's life meant cutting ties with his old family. The words stung, not because they were unexpected, but because they confirmed what I already felt in my bones. She hadn't simply forgotten me. She had erased me by design. Around the room, heads turned. I saw judgment flicker in people's eyes, not toward me, but toward her. When my son finally entered the hall, standing stiffly by her side, I studied his face. He smiled, but his jaw tightened each time someone mentioned the wedding. A neighbor congratulated him, but slipped in the question, "Why wasn't your mother there?" His eyes faltered, and I saw it. The first crack in his loyalty, the first shadow of doubt that perhaps he had gone too far. I said nothing. I didn't rush to defend myself, didn't beg for understanding. Instead, I stood quietly, my hands folded, my gaze steady. The truth was unraveling on its own, thread by thread, without me lifting a finger. And in that silence, for the first time in weeks, I felt the power shifting back into my hands. The weeks of silence cracked under the weight of bills. Rent notices stacked, late fees piled, and the small luxuries they had flaunted on social media were now slipping from their fingers. I could feel it in the desperate texts my son sent late at night, short, clipped, filled with ellipses as though shame itself lived between the words. His wife's tone in those messages grew sharper, blaming me as though my refusal to fund their life was cruelty. One evening, long after the neighborhood had gone quiet, a knock came at my door. When I opened it, there he was, my son. Not the groom in polished shoes and pride, but a tired man with circles under his eyes, his shoulders bent beneath the weight of choices that had finally cornered him. He stepped inside, his voice breaking before he could finish the first sentence. "Mom, I don't know what to do anymore." He collapsed into the chair like a child returning home after a nightmare. Words tumbled out, debts unpaid, promises made to his wife that he couldn't keep, fights that turned bitter. He admitted what I had long suspected. She had pressed him to cut me out, told him it was her or me, and in his blindness to love he had chosen her. I sat across from him, my heart twisting. Part of me wanted to cradle him, to tell him I would fix everything, as I had so many times before. But another part of me, stronger now, sharper, knew that fixing it for him would only bind me again in chains of thankless sacrifice. So I spoke with a firmness that surprised us both. I told him respect is not a decoration you wear when convenient. It is the foundation of family. I told him loyalty is tested not when life is easy, but when pressure demands betrayal. I told him love cannot exist where dignity is denied. His face crumpled, tears spilling as he reached across the table. His voice was a whisper, choked and trembling. "Mom, I made a mistake." I carried the weight of weeks in silence, watching how betrayal had shifted the ground beneath my life. I replayed the phone calls, the gossip, the cruel captions on photographs, and yet, as much as it hurt, I had not collapsed. I had stood tall. I had protected what little dignity remained. That was my victory. When my son returned again, his voice softer, his posture humbled, I listened differently. His words were no longer demands. They were admissions, debts mounting, a wife who was growing bitter, fights that cut deeper each day. For the first time, he asked rather than commanded, "Mom, what do I do?" I looked at him, the same boy I had raised, and felt the tug of love and pain at war in my chest. Part of me longed to erase his suffering, but another part, the wiser part, knew this was the moment to draw the line. I told him I would help, but not in the way he imagined. Money would not be handed over without respect, without boundaries. If he wanted my support, he had to acknowledge me not as an account, but as his mother. Respect first, money later. His wife fought the change. She glared at me with the same arrogance she had worn at the wedding. But I saw something new beneath it. Fear. The certainty that once dripped from her voice was cracking. She had gambled on erasing me, on using me as a silent purse, and now that purse had a lock she could not break. I met with my lawyer again, reinforcing every safeguard. The property deeds were secured in my name alone. The accounts were structured so I controlled the flow. The will was rewritten, not to punish but to ensure fairness, to make sure no one could twist my sacrifices into debts owed, and slowly, the community saw. Neighbors who once whispered pity now looked at me differently. They saw a woman who had been humiliated, yes, but who had stood firm, who had chosen dignity over begging. Their respect returned, not because I fought loudly, but because I survived quietly. One night, I sat at my table with a stack of old rent receipts, brittle and yellowing, each one a reminder of how many times I had saved him. I lit a match and watched them curl into ash. Then I placed the new will, framed and sealed, on the wall above my desk. It was not just paper, it was my declaration. As the last flame died, I whispered the words that had lived in my heart since the day of the wedding. They tried to erase me, but I wrote myself into a future they cannot take away. I never imagined that motherhood would bring me here, to this quiet, almost solemn chapter of my life, where love and betrayal lived side by side like two sharp edges of the same blade. I had once thought family was unbreakable, that the sacrifices of a mother stitched permanent bonds. But what I learned was harder, heavier. Bonds can fray, loyalty can be bought, and love, without respect, is fragile glass waiting to shatter. In those weeks of silence, I watched the world around me shift. Neighbors who once looked at me with whispers of pity now nodded in acknowledgement, as if they finally understood the strength it took not to crumble. My brother told me often, "You did the right thing. Anyone else would have begged, but you stood." His words were comfort, yes, but also a mirror. I didn't simply survive my son's betrayal. I rebuilt myself from it. My son began visiting me more often after that night when he whispered, "Mom, I made a mistake. He came not with pride, but with humility. Not with demands, but with questions. I could see the weight on him, the cracks his wife had carved in his confidence. She had promised him a life built on exclusivity, on shutting doors, but doors shut too tightly eventually choke the air. He was learning that lesson one suffocating breath at a time, and though my heart still carried bruises from what he had done, I gave him something he had forgotten. Patience. I told him respect had to come first, that love was meaningless if it trampled dignity. I didn't shower him with money, didn't erase his debts with the stroke of a pen. Instead, I gave him boundaries. I gave him lessons that had cost me everything to learn. The daughter-in-law, my so-called replacement, was not blind to this shift. I saw it in her eyes when she passed me in public. That mask of superiority she had once worn was cracking. Her arrogance, once so sharp, dulled with each bill she couldn't control, with each decision my son began making without her whisper in his ear. She had wanted me erased, but instead, I became the presence she could not silence. I met with my lawyer one final time. Together, we sealed the safeguards that had become my shield. The accounts were structured so no one could exploit me again. The property was secured in my name, untouchable by manipulation. My will was rewritten, not as an act of revenge, but as a statement of fairness. Everything was transparent, written in ink, no rumor or lie could erase. Then came the quiet victory, the one I hadn't expected. At another community gathering months later, people no longer asked why I hadn't been at the wedding. Instead, they asked me how I was doing, how I had held my ground. Some called me wise, others strong. But what mattered most was that they no longer saw me as the mother who had been humiliated. They saw me as the woman who had endured, who had chosen dignity when silence could have destroyed her. One evening, I returned to my kitchen table, the place where this storm had first broken over me. On the surface, I spread the old rent receipts, the reminders of every time I had been reduced to an ATM. One by one, I fed them to a small flame. The edges curled, blackened, then crumbled into ash. It was not anger that fueled me. It was release. I would not carry their weight anymore. Above the table I hung the new will, framed and sealed. It wasn't just legal protection. It was a declaration of my rebirth. A reminder to myself that I had the right to choose how my story would be written. No bride, no rumor, no betrayal could take that from me. When the last receipt was gone, when the air smelled faintly of smoke and closure, I spoke aloud, to no one but myself, to everyone who had ever doubted me. They tried to erase me, but I wrote myself into a future they cannot take away. And in that moment, for the first time in years, I felt not like a mother abandoned, but like a woman restored.